Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today for another EnergizED webinar. Just so you're aware, we're going to record this session, that way it can be posted on our website later. But just so you are aware, that is happening. Thank you again for joining us. This session is going to focus on zoning. So we have one of our planners here at the city, Ethan Mansfield, is going to present for us. And throughout the presentation, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. You should be able to access the chat by holding your mouse kind of over by the bottom of the screen. And you should see a little chat bubble there. You can write your questions. If it's something I can answer quickly for you, I will in the chat, although I don't know much about zoning, so that's not likely this time around. But please throw all your questions in there, and then at the end, I will run through them and ask them, and that way Ethan can respond to them all as well. And then if we still have a little leftover time, we can open it up for a little more Q&A if folks have other questions to throw out there. So with that, I am going to hand things over to Ethan and let him tell us all about zoning.
Thanks, Melinda. Yeah, my name's Ethan Mansfield. I'm a current planner with the City of Boise, and I am going to be presenting a little bit about the process of zoning and what it means at the city and how it actually works. So I'll share my screen. Let me know if anybody is experiencing issues, just raise your hand. I will also allow my computer sound. All right, so welcome to Zoning 101. So let's set the stage a little bit for why we even need to be talking about zoning. What's the point? So as you may have noticed, if you look out your window, even before the coronavirus, things have been changing in Boise. We are the 8th fastest growing metro area in the United States, and our valley added 20,000 people between July 2018 and July 2019. We now have 750,000 people living in the Treasure Valley. And while these are metro numbers, it's very clear that it's still, the number of people in the valley still impacts the economic activity and development scene within the city limits of Boise. Within Boise specifically, we're expecting 50,000 new residents in the next 20 years. That's 20,000 new households, assuming about 2.5 people per household. That equals 1,000 living units every year. And there's no way to really control the amount of people moving to the valley, with the exception of potentially building a wall around Idaho, which, you know, we've all thought about a little bit, but we can't really do it. So we have a lot of people moving here, and they're moving here because it's a nice place to live. So how do we accommodate them? Well, we can, you know, we have developers working on new construction projects. We have developers doing repurposing buildings and doing adaptive reuse and infill development. Those are kind of the 3 major ways developers are creating new housing product. New construction, an example of that would be like out at Harris Ranch or on the Warm Springs Mesa, any kind of new large subdivision. We see the repurposing of buildings a lot downtown with the Owyhee and the Safari Inn being repurposed from hotel uses to new living uses. And infill development may be the most sensitive piece of development in our current context, because what it means is when we're seeing new individual lots within established neighborhoods redevelop. So it's really important that we get this right, because, you know, it's important that these new developments fit into the neighborhood context. And that's one of the ways that zoning can really, really be impactful on a small individual lot level. So who decides what can be built? Well, the developer, on one hand, proposes something. In this economy and in this, this country, you know, we rely on private investment to build housing product. It's very important, and that's a critical piece. But if we just let that investment run amok, things might turn out not as we'd want to see them. That's why we have these rules and regulations in place to make sure that development works with the city and the state's vision. So, you know, where does this power for us to regulate land use come from? Well, the United States Constitution in the Fifth Amendment guarantees the rights of private property owners. And that's important to remember as developers come in and purchase property, they do have private property rights. In 1975, Idaho created the Local Land Use Planning Act, which required cities and other municipalities to develop a comprehensive plan with visions and policies that kind of outlined the direction of that the city wants to take. So this is kind of where policymakers get together and talk about kind of the general place they want to go. That then, the Local Land Use Planning Act also gives cities the power to enact zoning ordinances and control land use decisions. It's one of the very few powers that cities have, is to create these zoning ordinances. And it's actually extremely powerful. And it's really great that cities are able to control this, not the state and not the federal government. We can only imagine what would happen if the state was able to control Boise's land use, or the federal government. So here's LUPA. It requires all local jurisdictions to plan comprehensively and to implement the plan through the adoption of the zoning ordinance. And it gives us the authority to establish standards within each zoning district to regulate items such as building height, stories, construction, reconstruction, alteration, all these things that we'll talk about through this presentation. And again, this will be available online, so don't worry about reading and writing down all of this. So here's what this looks like. The city's vision is laid out in the comprehensive plan. That's supported with neighborhood plans and citywide initiatives, which you'll see on the next page. And that yields an implementation tool called the zoning ordinance. So this is what our comprehensive plan looks like. It outlines kind of what we want Boise to be known for, what we want to be in the future. It's really lofty, as it should be, and thus sometimes difficult for the zoning ordinance and all of its ins and outs and technicalities to always match up with the comprehensive plan, but we do our best to kind of align the two when we have new ordinances becoming codified in the zoning ordinance. So these are our kind of 7 core policy areas we really focus on: environmental stewardship, a predictable development pattern, stable neighborhoods and vibrant mixed-use activity centers, a connected community, culture, education, arts, and history, a strong, diverse economy, and a safe, healthy, and caring community. And we have, if you've ever read the comprehensive plan, I'm sure many of you have been inside it, we've got a plethora of more specific goals and objectives and specific policies that fall under each of these categories. So here are some of the citywide initiatives on your right that we use to also inform how we review development. Grow our housing, keep Boise moving. Grow our housing is attempting to provide adequate housing. That 1,000 housing units is a really important piece of our Grow Our Housing. Keep Boise Moving is our transportation initiative. Energize Our Neighborhoods is our neighborhood participation program that Melinda heads up. We have Boise Climate Now, which is kind of our environmental leadership initiative. And then we also have our neighborhood plans and our master plans. My neighborhood, the West Downtown neighborhood, just finished doing a neighborhood plan. The North End neighborhood is in the process. So I'd encourage you, if you haven't already, to get involved in your neighborhood and help kind of craft a vision for your neighborhood, which then gets added to the comprehensive plan. So how does zoning fit in with all this? Well, zoning is like the gears that kind of activate and help us, give us a framework for review of any new development that comes in. And so what we're trying to do at a high level is conserve and ensure and promote the public health, safety, and welfare of the community. We're trying to implement the city's vision, and we're trying to guide future growth and land use changes, and we're trying to balance competing rights while doing all of this. Because of course, you know, when a developer gets a piece of land, they're like, I want to build this on it. And the neighborhood might be like, this is a stupid thing to build. You know, we don't want a 20-story tall high rise in Northwest Boise. And so our zoning ordinance limits the height of certain areas in Northwest Boise. So you can't do that. And that's one way that it balances competing rights. So here is a pretty succinct and cool overview of what zoning is more specifically.
U.S. cities grow and develop thanks to a little-known and sometimes arcane set of rules and regulations known as the zoning code. Zoning influences everything from building heights to signage. Understanding the zoning code is key to understanding U.S. cities and how to influence them for the better. In this video, I'm going to go over the basics of zoning. I'm going to describe the pros and cons of zoning. And finally, I'm going to tell you how you can influence the zoning code in your community to make them more walkable, bikeable, and equitable. So let's start with zoning basics. The zoning code consists of two basic parts, the map and the regulations. Let's start with the map. If you've ever played a SimCity game, you have an idea of how a zoning map works. Every parcel in a city is placed in a zoning district that specifies the types of uses allowed. Now, every city can create their own zoning districts, but they all generally have the same basic types of districts. They are residential, from single-family homes to high-rise apartments in yellow, commercial, including retail, restaurants, and hotels, colored red, industrial, in gray, though some maps will show them in purple, institutional, which means schools and public buildings, typically in blue, and open space in green appropriately. Here's an example of a zoning map. You can see that most of the city is residential in yellow, there's a large industrial section in the northeast, and a few areas of commercial in red. Now zoning maps can get a lot more complicated than just 5 colors. Now in this example map here, you can see all of the colors just mentioned, with the addition of an orangish color for multifamily residential. It's common for zoning districts to separate not only uses, but intensity of uses. You'll often see C1, C2, and C3 zones, where the increasing number means it allows increasing levels of commercial density. In addition, you may also see overlay zones. These zones, as the name implies, lays over the top of other zones and adds additional restrictions and regulations within them. Okay, so that's the map. It assigns every parcel to a district that has its own set of rules regarding use and intensity.
Awesome. So now we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in the city of Boise itself. So as that handsome gentleman in the video mentioned, we've got our open lands. We have A1 and A2, which are typically occupied by parks, sometimes schools, sometimes churches, anything where you've got a single building with a ton of open space around it. You have residential zones, many residential zones, from R1A, which is our least dense residential zone at an allowed density of no more than 2 units per acre, 2.1 units per acre, all the way up through the R3 zone, which is our densest pure residential zone at 43.5 units per acre. And we also have a townhome zone, R1M, which allows for attached and single-family detached townhome style developments. We have 3 office zones, residential office, neighborhood office, and limited office. And we've got 5 commercial zones of varying intensity. C1 is the least intense to C5, which is kind of an anything goes, very flexible zone that is designed to be in really high use areas such as the downtown core, where you have more flexibility, and we'll talk about kind of what that looks like further in this presentation. We've got 4 different industrial zones, 2 which are designed for manufacturing, light manufacturing and heavy manufacturing, and then we have 2 technological park zones, think HP and Micron. And then we have a couple institutional or special purpose zones. Our health services and hospital zone, you know, that surrounds like St. Luke's, for example, St. Al's. And then we also have our university zone, which Leon is very familiar with as he's working on some changes to the university zone right now. So let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of zoning. So we'll first talk about land uses, then we'll talk about development standards, and we'll talk about the review process. All three of these are codified within our zoning ordinance. So let's dig into land uses. These address what you can do with your property and then what the rules are for each of the uses. So this kind of, our land uses, permitted and prohibited, kind of stems from our table of allowed uses. This is in our zoning code. Anyone can look it up, and I'd encourage you to check it out. We have a few different kind of variables, if you will, within our table of allowed uses. We have our A's, that stands for allowed. We have our A's with a star, as you can see here with your multifamily building, 3 to 6 units. In the R1M zone, that's an administrative review. That's a staff level review to ensure compliance with a set of standards or criteria. So if you're doing an administrative review, as a developer, you need to meet a certain set of criteria, and if you do that, you're administratively approved. We also have conditional uses, which are designed to have some flexibility to ensure that the use is appropriate in the specific place it's located within the zone. For example, we do conditionally allow some small multifamily in the R1C zone. That's what this C indicates. However, it not only needs to meet a list of requirements, but it also needs to be appropriate in the context. And those are decided by our Planning and Zoning Commission, which we'll talk about later on. And that's the role of the Planning and Zoning Commission, is to kind of make those judgment calls where there is some discretion. They also have the discretion to add conditions to make it more appropriate in a certain zone and kind of fit in better with the context of the area. We also have prohibited uses, which are indicated by a blank spot on our table of allowed uses. So for example, if you're doing a multifamily building with a density of 7 to 20 units per acre, that's simply not allowed in any of these single family residential zones. So as a developer, you shouldn't, that should be a very clear sign that, you can't do it. There are some exceptions to this prohibited use, and that's what a special exception is. That is used when there might be a very good use that makes sense in a zone where that use is actually prohibited. So a good example of that would be up on Emerald Street, where the use or the zone is R3, but they'd like to put in a small coffee shop and restaurant, which is a prohibited use in the R3 zone. However, it's on Emerald Street, which is a major thoroughfare, and it seems to make sense in the area. And so the developer applied for special exception. So next we'll talk about development standards. So that's like lot sizes and dimensional requirements of buildings. So here's a little video that'll help walk us through that.
After the use table comes the basic development requirements. This means standards for things like building setbacks and side yards, minimum lot sizes, and building heights. Every city has different requirements for their zoning districts. After the use tables and development requirements for each zoning district, most zoning codes will contain impact regulations, or regulations that are not specific to any one zoning district. These often include regulations for signage, parking standards, historic preservation standards, and urban design criteria.
Great. So let's talk about how that looks in the context of our zoning code. Each zoning district has requirements based on density, street frontage, minimum setbacks from property lines, maximum allowed height, minimum and maximum lot coverage, minimum and maximum parking requirements. So as current planners, as we're reviewing an application, whether that's making a recommendation to a council or commission body, or reviewing it for administrative approval, we ensure that these standards are met and that the development complies with each of these standards. We also have overlay zones. We have conservation district overlays like Hyde Park and the near North End. We have design review overlays, which are any zoning district with a D or double D appended to it. And that occurs throughout the city in most zones with the exception of single family zones. What that means is any changes to the exterior, whether that's just a minor exterior change or, you know, a new development's being constructed and thus a change is happening to the land, it does require some sort of design review, whether that's an administrative design review or something more complex that's reviewed by the design review committee. We also have neighborhood overlays, like the Big Sky and Sycamore, where neighborhoods get together and, you know, essentially say, hey, this is an issue, or we'd like to see more of this, and that becomes codified. For example, the Sycamore overlay provides for the use of like livestock or animals like horses and goats on areas smaller than 1 acre, which is the standard for the other parts of the city is 1 acre. We also have parking reduction overlays, and these overlays primarily are seen downtown, where it makes sense to have a parking reduction because there's kind of pseudo public organizations building parking garages so that parking is more socialized. That's like the Capital City Development Corporation building garages so that when people come and park downtown, you know, we're not requiring all new developments to build parking into each of their developments. We realize that that might look like an entire parcel might be devoted to parking for the use on the adjacent parcel. So to maintain consistency with the surrounding development, you know, we want to kind of socialize parking, hence the parking reduction overlays. We also have waterway overlays like the Boise River system and flood protection overlays. And so that's like your floodplain maps and then your Boise River system permits if you're developing near the Boise River. And we also have specific plans. These are essentially like new zoning codes that govern development in specific places. Harris Ranch and Barber Valley are kind of the two best examples of that. And that's why when you're driving out there, you see a lot of really different looking development, again, that looks different from your standard subdivision. Finally, we'll talk about the review process that's kind of codified within the development code. So we have really 3 different levels of decision making. And I've kind of alluded to each of them, but this kind of lays it out. This is a little bit of a confusing graphic, so I made some circles, and maybe that helps kind of clarify. So the most basic level of decision making is staff level. These are administrative decisions that are, again, kind of checking boxes to ensure compliance with specific rules. These can occur for design review applications that are relatively straightforward, like minor exterior changes, like maybe someone wants to put an awning on a shop in downtown. Administrative decisions in planning and zoning might look like an ADU approval or a duplex approval. And for the historic preservation administrative decision, that could look like a staff level approval of for a certificate of appropriateness, maybe like an addition to a porch on a non-contributing structure in the historic district. Your next level are going to be the committees and the commissions. And that's where more discretionary permits go to not only, you know, be hashed out by a board of, you know, kind of, you know, preeminent thinkers in our community, but also gives a lot more opportunity for public input, although public input is, you know, allowed and encouraged at all of these levels. You know, the design review committee will review larger projects that have a little more discretion than maybe staff feels comfortable with making, or decision staff feels comfortable making. The Planning and Zoning Commission will review conditional use permits and planned unit developments. They'll also make recommendations to the city council for larger items like rezones and annexations, things that really could change the development pattern of a particular location moving forward. And the Historic Preservation Commission might make decisions on something like a certificate of appropriateness to say, add a second story to a contributing structure or something of that nature, that might be pretty contentious, but may be contextually a good idea. And then the city council makes those final decisions on big things like rezones and annexations and also special exceptions, which we talked about earlier, that are things that are prohibited within particular zones. Every single level of these may be appealed to the next level. So your staff level decisions can always be appealed to your commission or committee, depending on the nature of the application. And then your commission level decisions can get appealed to city council. The reason I'm not really talking much about district court is that's where these things go for judicial review. So after a city council decision is made, if there's still some serious contention and either the neighborhood doesn't like the decision or the developer doesn't like the decision or any interested party doesn't like the decision, they can appeal to judicial review, where it then goes to the district court. And that district court gets to decide whether that gets heard or gets thrown back to city council for reconsideration. So again, here's kind of a little matrix of what types of applications are heard by the different review bodies. We've kind of gone over this. For rezones, your Planning and Zoning Commission will make a recommendation to City Council. Similarly, that goes for annexations. Conditional use permits and planned unit developments, the final review is with the Planning and Zoning Commission. Special exceptions go to the commission and then council. Variances can sometimes be reviewed administratively at the staff level, given a certain set of criteria are met. And most variances will go to the Planning and Zoning Commission to be heard. Design review, again, under certain circumstances, they can be reviewed administratively, but often they do go to the Design Review Committee for larger projects or the Historic Preservation Commission. So these processes are all codified, as I mentioned, and you can see that there's kind of a detailed process to follow for each one. The conditional use permit is kind of the all-encompassing one that's a great example to use. For any application that goes before the Planning and Zoning Commission to be heard, we do require a pre-application conference. That conference is where we sit down with the developer and we talk about their initial ideas to ensure that, hey, you're way off base here, or no, this looks like it's good, it just needs some minor changes, or yeah, this looks really good, and we can take this to the commission without huge changes and we think it's a good project. Similarly, those commission level hearings require a neighborhood meeting to be held prior to the application submittal. And this is a great time for the neighborhood to get involved. Those neighborhood meetings are critical, and good developers will really engage the neighborhood and ask for feedback. Unfortunately, as with human beings in general, there are excellent developers and then there are not so excellent developers. And we've seen that projects that do engage the neighborhood do tend to be more successful, more appreciated by the neighborhood. They go through faster because they don't have opposition at later phases because they've worked that all out in the beginning. So that neighborhood meeting is a critical step. After application submittal, we provide notice. We review the application at the staff level. Staff then makes a recommendation to the public hearing, to the Planning and Zoning Commission, or that could be the Design Review Committee or the Historic Preservation Commission. They make a decision, and then these things can be modified with a new permit, and they can also be appealed if the decision is, if a party agrees that the decision was made arbitrarily or capriciously, or there's several other kind of standards of appeal. So here's how the public can most effectively participate in project review once it hits current planning's plate. The first thing is to attend the neighborhood meeting. Very, very important. If the developer doesn't hear from you, he won't know, or she won't know, what elements to design in the process. It's also important to provide a written letter to the City of Boise stating how you feel about the project. It does make a difference if there are thousands, hundreds, or thousands or tens even of letters expressing dissent over a particular aspect of the project. That aspect may easily get changed at the public hearing. And then also providing public testimony at the hearing itself is very important. Even if you've already written a letter, it's important to show up and be heard. Participating in neighborhood events is a great way to be involved and to kind of hear about new initiatives coming down the pike. It's a little bit less kind of pointed as far as the current planning process, but open houses talking about a rezone, for example, are excellent ways to learn more about it, and also to provide public comment early, to really be able to step in and give feedback early. That helps the city, especially in a city-led rezone process, for example, understand what might not be palatable and what, if anything, needs to be changed about the project. So there are also some cons of zoning. Exclusion is probably one of the largest ones. Zoning in the past has been used to discriminate against different races and cultures, and it also kind of creates a monoculture of similar uses, which is kind of also falls under the segregation of uses, which when you segregate uses, such as you put residential on one side of town and you put industrial on the other side of town, well, you're generating a lot of trips to go from your residential community to your industrial community. So weighing those is against the public health and safety of the community is really important to do when developing the zoning ordinances. It's also a little bit difficult to ensure consistency across all regulations adopted at different time periods. One piece of the code might say one thing and another piece might say another thing. So we're constantly going through and trying to clean up and make consistent the zoning code so that we don't have confusion and we can provide a predictable and stable development pattern. And I'll let this gentleman explain more about some of the cons of zoning.
That's a really quick overview of the zoning code. At this point, you may be thinking to yourself, that all sounds really reasonable. And you know what? You're right, it is reasonable. And that's one of the benefits of zoning. Zoning tries its best to ensure that new development is built in a way that's predictable, reasonable, and minimizes impact to adjacent property owners. It's why city leaders installed zoning codes in many cities over 100 years ago. Zoning ensures that an oil refinery can't be built adjacent to a neighborhood of single-family homes. I think we can all agree that's a pretty worthwhile goal. Increasingly, however, planners, civic leaders, and community members have begun to question the practice of zoning. For all of its positive aspects, there are quite a few negative qualities too, and I'll list a couple of the biggest ones. First, communities can use zoning codes as a tool of exclusion. Historically, this happened explicitly. Cities would literally write zoning codes that excluded people from districts based on skin color or ethnicity. Now, these were clearly unconstitutional and eventually removed, but these explicit codes gave way to implicit ones that many communities still use today. The most common way to exclude people using the zoning code is by imposing large minimum lot size requirements and other regulations that increase the cost of building a home. If new homes must be built on 1 acre lots or larger, for example, only large expensive homes will be built. This allows cities to become enclaves for the rich at the expense of low and moderate income families. The second major criticism comes from the segregation of uses that I described as a positive before. Segregating uses can also lead to sterile environments and force citizens to travel large distances between different zones for trips to work, school, shopping, and home. Many communities have introduced mixed-use zones that allow for a mixture of residential and commercial uses to mitigate this problem, though mixed-use zones are typically not widespread across zoning maps. Alternatives to traditional single-use zoning, such as form-based codes, aim to reform zoning and move away from the segregation paradigm. Form-based codes regulate the size and shape of buildings instead of their use. So that's zoning in a nutshell. Potentially useful, but probably could be better. How do you make zoning work better in your community?
So that last question is a question that we're constantly asking ourselves as staff, and we're kind of challenging the community to ask about, especially as we, start to think about the effort to take a look more closely at our zoning code and potentially have a rewrite or at least change major pieces of it. So let's talk a little bit about the different types of zoning, and then we'll talk about our zoning code, and then we'll wrap it up. So there's a few different types of zoning that we can use to kind of regulate a project kind of at a high level. So we've got the Euclidean zoning, and that's kind of like the historic zoning that we always think about, where you have a different zone for each land use, and then each zone is then subject to a different set of regulations. It's basically the table of allowed uses. We have our form-based codes, and that focuses on physical characteristics, and it kind of seeks not necessarily to regulate the use, but to regulate kind of what the buildings look like. Form-based wouldn't really necessarily care if you've got a residential use, an office use, or a commercial use in a specific building. What it does care about is how that building is oriented to the street, whether there's street trees in front of it, whether there's maybe how many stories you can go, what the setbacks for each story look like. That's kind of form-based. And we do have quite a bit of form-based code in our zoning code. Another type of zoning is incentive zoning, and that encourages amenities and community needs and rewards developments in defined areas. So an example of that might be our multifamily standards and PUD standards, where we give bonuses in density if certain projects are located on arterials with planned or expected transit opportunities. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to incentivize development to go there by allowing developers to build more, because those people who live there are going to have more access to transportation options and thus less likely to, extend infrastructure or drive on a bunch of roads that don't have transit. Finally, there's performance zoning. An example of this would be like a floor area ratio, kind of basically giving a ton of flexibility to the developer as long as they, comply with a certain amount of some sort of design criteria, or not even necessarily design, but like requirements placed upon them by the city. So a floor area ratio, for example, is by saying, you can have a floor area ratio of 2, which means that you can build a building with twice the floor area of the lot that it sits on. What we have is kind of a mix of all of these. We've created this hybrid zoning code that we hope takes the best of each of these, combines them into something that we think works, relatively well. So our zoning code, just for a little bit of kind of wrap up history, was written in 1965. It's 440 pages of predominantly text, and it's been amended and reorganized hundreds of times over that time period. So it's also worth noting that these new amendments, so anytime we amend or reorganizing, we're really seeking to reflect the input of the comprehensive plan, neighborhood plans, and city initiatives. So that's kind of when we amend or modify or reorganize the zoning code, that's what we're kind of using to inform that modification. So let's talk a little bit about a couple modifications, and then we'll wrap up. So two of the more, I think, more impactful modifications as far as allowing additional units, and again, this reflects our Grow Our Housing initiative, have been duplexes and accessory dwelling unit modifications. So the duplex piece of our code allows 2 units to be built on a lot within a single family zone, given that certain criteria are met. This is an administrative level approval. So we're making it somewhat easier to do this for developers to do this with these very strict guidelines on how they can do it. So we kind of outline for them in the code what they need to do, And then if they do that, they are allowed a duplex. Similarly with accessory dwelling units, this is a low impact way to add new units and I think increase the role of citizen developer, because we see so many, people who aren't developers who are looking to add a unit of density on their lot. Maybe it's for a family member, maybe it's for a friend, there's a lot of different reasons someone would want to do this, but it is really important because it highlights that every single citizen of the city can be a developer, and is in some cases when they add an accessory dwelling unit. And it's a really low impact way. So you're not kind of getting into like a PUD where we need to, stringently look at parking requirements or amenity requirements or any of that. We're just saying, you know what, put a unit above your garage, make sure there's parking on the street, make sure it's not huge, limit of 700 square feet. Make sure it has 2 bedrooms or fewer. There's a couple other restrictions, and you can do it. From a neighborhood participation perspective, we've really beefed up 2 sections of our code to help kind of enhance the neighborhood participation. Our neighborhood meeting requirements have recently changed to allow more time for the developer to take into account comments made at neighborhood meetings. And we've also changed the noticing of the development site to require larger signs for bigger, more impactful developments, so that people are kind of made aware of those bigger projects. And then we've also included language, and this is a while back, around substandard lots. And I'll talk about that here in a second. On the left, you'll see what used to get built on substandard lots. And then on the right, you'll see kind of what the goal of the substandard lot ordinance attempts to achieve. And so, lots that are substandard are, we've defined as smaller than our minimum lot size, and there exists a lot of those across the city. We talked a little bit about minimum lot sizes earlier in our development standards section. But of course, there's lots that exist that are much smaller than that. And so instead of just allowing an anything goes approach to those particular lots, we've required certain forms, including additional building height restrictions and kind of landscape improvements and other design restrictions to ensure that those substandard lots do match the character of the surrounding neighborhood. Going back to noticing really quick, here's what we've begun to require for larger public projects. And if you'd like to hear more about this, there's more information in our code, and also we have some collateral that addresses it. But these big signs are a new thing for us. The rest of the valley's been doing them, but we implemented them and are, think they'll do a better job of just making people aware of what the project is, especially with that visual graphic. So we'd love to hear from everybody about, your ideas for what could or maybe shouldn't be included in the next zoning code update, or some concerns with current zoning or questions. Please participate in our upcoming events, whether that's open houses around a specific amendment change, or it's an Energize event like this one. We love your participation, and it means a lot to us because we know that we're not just speaking to an empty room or an empty computer screen. And providing us with written feedback, either online or just directly to any planner, please feel free to do that. It's very important that we hear feedback because we don't know how good a job we are or are not doing without that feedback. And with that, thanks for listening. And Melinda, do you want to moderate some questions?
I would love to. Thank you, Ethan. That was great.
Thanks.
All right, so we have quite a few questions here in the chat. I'm going to start with those, and then if there's others at the end, you can continue to put them in the chat, or we can do the raising your hand option here. So let's start out here with a question about parking. Can you tell us a little bit about what studies or data is used to determine the number, maximum or minimum, of parking places that are needed if a certain site is being developed?
Yeah, great question. So this number comes from a a parking trip generation manual that's been produced at a national level. And I'm not sure how, I believe that most of our parking standards kind of start there, and then they kind of change as necessary given like local requirements or conditions. But it is a generated like demand estimation model that requires certain parking. And I know that there are some updates going on to that. But that's kind of where it starts. And then I think as local conditions may change, we do try and change that primarily with parking overlays. Does that answer the question, kind of?
Hopefully. I think most of our participants are muted, so.
Perfect.
He says yes. Thank you.
I'll let Melinda speak for them.
Thanks, Ethan. Okay. So here's a question. How are the city planning and zoning, historic preservation, the commissions, basically all of those, integrated within the county's planning and zoning commission, or are they?
So that's a great question. They are separate entities. So land use decisions within the city are decided on by the commissions and our city council, whereas land use decisions made in the county are kind of governed by the county's planning and zoning commission there and the county commissioners. So current planning efforts of each city are kind of separate from each other.
Great, thank you. Can you speak a little bit about how demolitions within a neighborhood are handled?
Sure. So currently, in most neighborhoods, a demolition permit is a building permit requirement. Recently, the City of Boise has requested that those demo permits be sent to planning and zoning so that we can look over them to make sure we're not doing anything too sensitive or, for lack of a better word, dumb to our neighborhoods. And so this is a little bit different, obviously a lot different in the historic preservation overlay. So in historic districts, demolitions are handled very differently, and it is a certificate of appropriateness to demo anything, and most contributing structures aren't even allowed to be demoed. But in the other parts of the city, it's historically been a building permit, but we are requesting that we look over those building permits, and there has been some movement on a demolition ordinance to kind of require demolitions to be more carefully considered by the developer.
Great, thank you. Okay, shifting gears slightly here. Can you speak a little bit about how COVID is affecting public participation at neighborhood meetings? And then also maybe a little bit about how that's also affecting planning and zoning and city council meetings.
That's a great question. So we have allowed some flexibility with the way people hold neighborhood meetings. I'll start with the neighborhood meeting thing first, and then we'll go to our council and commission hearings. So yeah, with neighborhood meetings, we are allowing some flexibility. You know, we're allowing these to be held over Zoom, and we were, and I think actually now that we've moved back to phase 3, we still are allowing these to be held exclusively over Zoom. As we move into phase 4, if that ever happens again, we will probably go back to having some sort of social distancing requirement, but currently allowed via Zoom. And we're also encouraging kind of appointment-based things. So like if you can set up a time, like we're encouraging developers to, you know, set up kind of office hours and then saying like, please sign up here if you'd like to come by and talk, or just allowing social distancing. So, you know, I know that we're still obviously soliciting feedback. We're requiring developers to solicit feedback, and hopefully that hasn't changed participation too much, just by changing the format a little bit. As far as commission, I should talk about that too. As far as the commission meetings, you know, we have gone fully virtual with those. we still see, at least the ones that I've participated in, we see plenty of lively debate. However, it does make it more challenging simply because you can't be in attendance. I think it's more challenging for everybody. However, I think allowing an online component as we reopen, in addition to an in-person component, will really actually expand our reach and expand the amount of public involvement. Although it certainly is challenging to not be able to attend in person and does present some technological challenges, although I think we've handled them relatively well as a city, and I think we're doing a pretty good job still hearing everybody.
Great, thank you. Just to jump back really quick, we had a follow-up question about the demolitions.
Sure.
When people do decide to demo and they receive their permit to do that, does that require neighborhood notification of any kind?
For normal demolitions that go with a building permit, no, it does not. Building permits don't require any neighbor notice. So again, one of the things we are considering is including a planning permit, or at least planning approval before demolition, like a demolition ordinance in our development code, which would be the only way we'd really be able to officially look over, other than just kind of like take a quick glance at it, and actually review demolition permits. So that may include in the future, and I'm not sure, but one of those things that we could consider would be neighborhood meeting or a neighborhood notification for demolitions.
Great, thank you. Okay, back to where we were a moment ago. We have a question about the larger zoning ordinance revision that's being considered. So several questions along those same lines. Why is the city considering doing this? What will the process be, and how will the public be involved? Who is advising the staff and elected officials during this process? So I don't know if you can speak to all of that. We can absolutely follow up individually with more detailed information about that if you don't have all of those details right now.
Yeah, and those are really good questions, and while I have some knowledge of them, I really don't want to say something that's not correct and then lead everybody who's listening astray. So I'm going to defer that one to Andrea, who is kind of leading, Andrea Tuning, who is kind of leading the charge there. I will say that, our current ordinance does have some issues, and I think the new ordinance kind of is seeking to create a more modern, updated, sleeker product that we can actually much more effectively govern land use with. It's just going to be better because it won't, there's just so many things that as a current planner, we review these projects every day, and we're going through this 440-page zoning code, and we're saying, why do I have this piece here conflicting with that piece there? Which one do I use? Stuff like that happens all the time. And while it is a pretty good code and it's very effective at, producing harmony and such throughout the community, I think it definitely could be better. And that's what this zoning code is seeking to achieve.
Great, thank you. And we'll follow up with more of those specifics about that question as well. All right, next up, can you speak a little bit about requirements for notifying the neighborhood associations? The question here specifically is, would it be better if the city planners were the ones who notified the neighborhood association rather than the developers, where some developers do and others don't get good neighborhood input? Maybe if you could speak a little to why that is on the developer to do, and kind of maybe a little detail about how that process works.
Yeah, that's a great question. So because we won't have officially received an application from the developer, and we don't really, we don't really need to receive an application from the developer until he or she is ready to submit. But the neighborhood meeting requirements are in place solely so that the developer and the neighborhood association and neighborhood constituents have an opportunity to interact before planning says, here's our thoughts, here's our opinion. We do that a little bit at the pre-application meeting, but not much. We really mainly are encouraging those developers to really consider the feedback from neighborhood liaisons and neighborhood associations. Now, whenever we review a neighborhood meeting, a neighborhood meeting list that was sent to applicants, so developers are required to provide that with any sort of commission level application. We make sure that all residents and owners are included there. And I'd need to take a look at our ordinance to see whether or not neighborhood association is explicitly called out. If it's not, we can't require that, but we do include the neighborhood association contact whenever we generate a list of people that the developer is required to notify. So in other words, we push for it because we generate the lists that the developer sends out. And the reason we don't do it is because we haven't yet seen the application. So, you know, based on the feedback from the neighborhood meeting, the developer may just choose not even to hold the project or not even to build the project. But we as a city don't really want to be involved in that preliminary process at that point. It's not really our place. And we do provide notification after the application has been submitted, and we require the site to be posted. And we also, as the city, send out the notification to all residents for like a conditional use permit, for example, within 300 feet of the project, or for a variance within the adjacent property owners and residents. So we do notification. It's just not at the neighborhood meeting stage.
Great, thanks, Ethan. Can you speak a little bit about any recent changes to street setbacks that may have happened recently? It says here, I've noticed multi-housing units closer to the streets, for example, on Franklin.
Sure, yeah, so there's a couple things that you might be noticing there. That is likely baked into our code through our multifamily living uses section. So developers can take advantage of reduced street setbacks in certain pieces of our code. So your standard residential, your standard setback for residential zones, is 15 feet to living space. But, there might be a different zone or a different type of use that may allow different setbacks. So perhaps this project is getting developed in a commercial zone where the setback is, less than 15 feet. And they maybe did that through a planned unit development process where multifamily living is allowed within a commercial zoning designation. So it is a really complicated code, but that might be one way that, you're seeing different setbacks, because a lot of these corridors are traditionally commercial corridors, but because of housing demand, developers are now building housing along these corridors. Thus, you're seeing residential products in commercial zones, and that's done through a planned unit development process. Does that make sense? Sorry, I guess you're on mute. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm happy to follow up later.
Thanks, Ethan. Can you speak a little bit about some of the older style types of homes that are built on substandard lots that occasionally are still popping up unexpectedly within the neighborhoods? How is that happening?
Sure. So I'm assuming we're talking about existing small lots or any.
By that, am I on? Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
By that, I mean when a house has been demolished and two new ones slide in and there's no curb or gutter put in, there's parking right up to the lawn. It looks like your first slide on the left of the two slides you showed us. Those are still popping up in my neighborhood.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, that's a great point. So I'll go to that slide really quickly so we can take a look. So what happens there is oftentimes, especially with these old subdivision plats, individuals at that time would buy multiple lots and build a single home over 2 or 3 different smaller lots, narrower lots. So you could kind of customize your lot size, if you will. So the developer, you know, in the anywhere between 1890 and 1940 or 50 could kind of, you know, plat these lots as narrow as they'd like. Generally, they were 25 feet to 35 feet. And the owner would purchase kind of like a la carte, like, oh, I'd like 3 lots to build my home on, or I'd like 2, or I'd like 4. So as these homes become dilapidated and unlivable, new developers will come in and essentially revive the existing lots. And that has been, you know, that's legal here. It's legal. I don't know. I'm sure there's a court case out there somewhere where a developer has sued the city, and then it's gone really far in the court system, and we are now kind of obligated to recognize those original lots as buildable, providing they meet certain criteria. The substandard lot ordinance is intended to kind of regulate those exact lots. And so a requirement is curb, gutter, and sidewalk, unless that requirement is waived by the design review committee. So that may be what's happening in your case, and I can't speak to that specific case for sure, but that's kind of how it has evolved. And the idea is that we're seeing fewer lots like what we see on the left and more like we see on the right. And it may be that the care of the lot has just degraded over time, and that's kind of on the owner and the developer, I guess, to kind of maintain that. But, you know, when it's built, we do require, you know, landscaping in the front, open space requirements, things like that. So, you know, I can get back to you on more specifics if you have a specific property you're interested in hearing more about and the permitting history there. I'm happy to dig into that for you.
I guess I have a particular property the house was just razzed last month, and right beside it are a pair of the left style of infill, and I'm hoping that that pattern doesn't continue on this new lot that's right next to those, because to me that's unacceptable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly why this substandard lot ordinance is in place, is to protect those new developments and make them hopefully appear more like what we're seeing on the right and less what we're seeing on the left. So I'm hoping that a substandard lot ordinance does its job and it turns out well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Ethan, looks like one final question here that I'm seeing so far. I'm hoping I'm not missing anybody, but could you please define the term or the concept of upzoning?
Sure. So what upzoning is when there's a piece of property that has a certain defined use that's maybe less intense, and it's turning into a use that may allow more density or slightly more intensity. The reason that upzoning may take place is to accommodate more families moving into a neighborhood.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions, and we are a little over our time. So at this point, we are going to wrap things up for today. As always, if you have a question that pops into your mind later on, please feel free to shoot us an email and we will get a response back to you. You can always reach us at energize@cityofboise.org or reaching out to us individually if you would like. So thank you all so much for coming today, and thank you, Ethan, for doing a great job. We appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
We'll see you guys at our next 2 EnergizED options coming up. We are taking a slight break over the 4th of July holiday, so our next presentation won't be until July 15th, but that one is really going to dive into design review and kind of how that looks and how that works within our neighborhoods. And then after that, on July 22nd, we will get into the details of the planning and development review process in depth. So we hope we'll see you then. Thank you all.